welcome into yet another edition of the Baseline Jumper podcast. My name is Jason Goldstein, and I'm joined by a man who, after he won the horse tournament last week, ended up getting traded to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers today. This man is a multi-sport athlete and a pro cyclist, Benjamin McDonald. Ben, how'd it feel? You won the horse tournament, and now you're going to play with Tom Brady.
Well, in all seriousness, I do want to give the people an update. Ben officially biking up hills. It's a big moment for me. The hills of Pittsburgh are no match for this lanky white New Yorker, it turns out. So proud days here in the Flo/Ben household. And things are looking up, and I'm looking forward to Tampa Bay, Jason. On to Tampa Bay.
Wow. Man, a few words. The reason why I had that little pun to segue between two sports, because this is going to be a multi-sport podcast. Obviously, if you're listening to this, you love both of us, or you hate both of us, but you love basketball. So we're going to recap parts 1 and 2 of The Last Dance that aired this past weekend on ESPN. And then we are going to give a little NFL draft preview, because with this worldwide pandemic that's going on, this is going to be unlike any draft we've ever seen. So, Ben, it's a little fitting that last week we had a Ben's Bulls Bliss, and you were overjoyed to talk about Garpax and at least one of them being replaced and Boylan being out the door. But now your team is at the front and center of the NBA world during a time in which the playoffs were about to start. This should have been the first week of round 1 of the playoffs. So how does it feel as a Bulls fan, and just as a basketball fan in general, that ESPN moved up the timeline of The Last Dance, and your team is front and center for the next 5 Sundays, well, 4 after this, but 2 parts down, 8 to go. Great content.
I mean, it feels very different between the two. As a Bulls fan, it feels great. The Bulls were, spoiler alert, not going to make the playoffs this year. They were not a very good team. They were such a bad team that the most exciting part of this season was a combo between when their front office got fired and the new general manager got hired, or the new president of basketball operations, I should say. But regardless, I think that speaks to where the Bulls were at. As a basketball fan, it's a little disappointing, probably all in all. I mean, this was a great year for the playoffs, but really The Last Dance was I think, everything that I was hoping for and more. I was unsure how much they were going to give the background. Especially as someone who grew up in the 90s, you know, the 80s part of Jordan's career is sort of mythical, but it's not something I got to experience. I didn't get to see any of that. The early 90s stuff was still kind of, you know, I was very young for the early 90s Bulls, but that second three-peat, you know, I was old enough to watch it with my parents, and I actually wrote my college essay about the flu game. So it has a special place in my heart. And I guess for me, I mean, it's obviously really exciting. I mean, I think as a basketball fan, though, a little disappointing. But my takeaway is just that this is the amazing part of the NBA. And the thing that makes the NBA different than every other sports league right now is that there just aren't these guys for the other sports leagues. I mean, who is the baseball player? And they mentioned it. I think it was Michael Wilbon in there who mentions, you know, there's only a few of these guys who are really there. There's Muhammad Ali, there's Babe Ruth, and Michael Jordan. I mean, basketball seems to be able to create these guys in a way that is captivating. This team was captivating. Watching the segments where they go to Paris and everyone is just awestruck by Michael Jordan. I mean, that's the thing that one of my big takeaways from basketball fan is, what a great place the game is in, and what a wonderful sport, and what a wonderful canvas for these artists to paint on. You have these amazing athletes who are able to tell their stories and become more than just athletes, brands, symbols for things, and really international superstars who are known around the world, really. I mean, you see what happened in Paris. So, I mean, to me, that's my big takeaway. What about you? What did you take away from this?
So before we get into specifics, I really like the jumps in time, because going into this documentary, not knowing anything about the structure, I was under the impression that they were going to be episode 1, training camp, episode 2, preseason, talk of the contracts with Scotty and Mike and Phil. But no, they started with ring number 5, the ceremony, and then they ended episode 1 with that same ring ceremony. I love the jump back to Jordan's college years. I love that they talked about his early seasons where he didn't garner too much respect, and then that game against the Bucks where he led them to a come from behind win, and the veterans on that team, which were not known for the best reputation, were like, okay, this is the guy. And then that's what prompted Jerry Krause when he took over as the GM to kind of get that roster, build it around Michael, get Pippen with that high pick. Bring in Oakley, who they traded away. Get a guy like Harper, Bill Wennington, Luke Longley, Steve Kerr, Tony Kukoc. The list goes on. So I really like the jump in time. And then the one thing from the college years, because, for a player of Jordan's stature, and I know this wasn't the norm back in the day, but he actually was going to do all 4 years in North Carolina. And Dean Smith, the legendary Dean Smith, who was the coach at the time, said, hey, Mike, you need to go pro. Forego your senior year. You need to go now. It's time to go. And I thought for a coach during that time, like you have Michael Jordan on your team and they let him leave. He ended up finishing his degree during one of the years he was injured. And I just thought that was really cool because that's the type of coach players want to play for. And I truly think that Michael made the right choice. I mean, he would have been a top pick if the Rockets and the Blazers didn't need big men. Don't you think?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that it's also just speaks to a different time. There's a lot of things there. I mean, Dean Smith was really known as that kind of guy. I mean, he encouraged Bob McAdoo to leave early as well. We were talking about Bob McAdoo before the show, and that's one of the things Bob McAdoo said. Dean Smith came up to him and said, Bob, you have a family to take care of. You don't necessarily come from wealth, and basically, this is an opportunity for you. And it's very similar to what he said to Jordan, which is like, you're a top 3 pick. This is something you should go do. If you're going to get drafted that highly, this is a good financial decision. So I do think that says a lot for Dean Smith. I mean, I loved, as you said, the background. I loved getting to know the characters. I'm interested to see what else we see, but it's also great to see the buildup because of the respect other players had for him. That's something that you notice kind of right away. When Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and Isaiah Thomas are basically all coming out, and these are contemporaries, guys who are competing with him. A guy like Isaiah Thomas had a very fraught relationship with Michael Jordan, as most people who are basketball fans know. So to see those guys, rivals, come out and just say, oh my God, how incredible this guy was. That was really amazing. And, one of the things too that I thought was really cool about The Last Dance, and I don't know, I'm smiling as I say this, was that my wife, Flo, who she likes basketball, but she's not an NBA fan exactly.
She likes baseline jumper.
Yeah, well, of course. But she's not someone who's going to go out of her way necessarily to watch NBA games all the time. And she was just as interested as I was, which is saying something because I was very interested. But she loved it too. And I think it just speaks to this great mythology of that team and of Michael Jordan. And that's what was so cool, to get to know the history and to get to know them made them more. And I think that was what was cool, is that it felt like an intimate documentary where you really start to get to know the team a little bit. And it felt a bit the way that you do with some of these other smaller scale documentaries that we see where they're about, just one person. Like, I mean, ostensibly when you think of like Tiger King, which is this massively viral documentary, it's about—
Please do not compare The Last Dance to Tiger King.
I just mean, it was interesting because there's this captivating aspect of it, that you have this documentary that has to go so crazy, and it's really only about a couple people and insular characters. And then you see something like this, and they're able to take this team that people who aren't even interested about, who aren't basketball fans. I mean, I think a lot of people, the team itself, they didn't know a lot, but you could really pull them in. And that's what I felt in the first 2 episodes, that they pulled us in, and they didn't have to do it with, a murder plot, a crazy Tiger thing. Like, it was cool to see that this it could stand on its own 2 feet without anything crazy. Like, it was just great storytelling. And I guess that's what I loved about it, was the storytelling and the characters that they helped create. I mean, obviously they're real people, but they create the characters by giving the narrative. And I loved that. I thought that was awesome. and it made me really interested to watch the next 8 episodes.
Well, of course. So, I mean, you're a Bulls fan. Like, you have to watch this anyway. Like, obviously, I watch it because I love basketball,
Right.
but just knowing that we're going to recap this for the next few episodes, like, it made me that much more inclined to, like, not just watch it, but pay attention. So, if we're going to make one comparison to Tiger King, we could say that future Phil Jackson with the Knicks was Joe Exotic. Fair or no? Not Bulls Phil Jackson, not Lakers Phil Jackson, but Knicks Phil Jackson.
I'm going to make a different comparison. I'm going to say Michael Jordan might be like the John Reinke in that if you could tear his legs off and he would just still keep going. There's no way to stop him.
Fair enough.
But yeah.
Fair enough. And this doc just made me want to kind of stop the MJ LeBron comparisons because we're talking 2 different eras of basketball, and they're both great and dominant. And Michael was great, and it took for the Bulls to add to that core, as I said earlier, in order to compete for championships. And I think, when you think of Michael Jordan and the Bulls, the logical next thought that comes to mind is Scottie Pippen. So it's kind of cool, like episode 2, they started off with Pippen's background, and they profiled him, being in Arkansas, being a high draft pick from a small school, and then just being like a jack of all trades in the NBA. And then when he signed that contract in 91, right, it was like 7 years, a little more than $18 million. If that's not the most bargain basement contract in NBA history, Ben, I don't know what is. So what do you make of Pippen playing through that? And then obviously his frustration during that 97-98 season kind of came to a boil because he knew he wanted money and he was not getting it from the Bulls.
Well, I'd say 2 things. I mean, the first thing that jumps out right at you is if you're really being honest about it, what you realize is if they don't underpay Pippen, there's a really good chance that this team doesn't stay together because they hemmed and hawed at keeping it together. They talked about how they almost didn't bring it back for this year. Well, here's something that you're never going to hear Jerry Krause or Jerry Reinsdorf say on the record, but if they weren't paying pennies to Scottie Pippen, they wouldn't have paid all the money they did to Michael Jordan and Phil Jackson those last years. So I think that was a big reason that the team actually stayed together, weirdly, is because, and spoiler alert if you didn't know that, they stayed together because the management didn't mind paying them because they were getting such a discount on the second best player on the team. So I think that made a big deal. The other
he
point
was
that I wanted,
second best player in the league those 2 years that MJ took an 18-month vacation, as he said on the.
Yeah, he was one of the best.
Outro.
It's hard to relitigate now who was great. There was a lot of great players, but I will say this: the comparison aspect. One of the things that it jumped out at me, and I don't know why this was the first thing that jumped out at me, but watching MJ shoot those mid-range shots and remembering, oh yeah, this was a guy who on the back 9 of his career, no pun intended, was a mid-range shooter. Maybe the best mid-range scorer of all time. Actually, you know what? The best mid-range scorer of all time. I'm not going to even put a maybe in front of it. He was the best mid-range scorer of all time. And it did make me think to myself, oh my goodness, can you imagine if he played in today's game and he had learned to shoot a 3? I don't know what you would have done if he could pull up.
The shooters you put around him. Like imagine like Mike playing with Stephen Clay, right? Like the attention he would draw in the middle and kicking out to the corners, it'd be raining threes.
So I highly recommend you read this article by Kirk Goldsberry that was from like last week. But his mid-range percentage, especially towards the end of his last year, basically on the Bulls, was down a little bit, but he was prolific from the mid-range. And the thought of like, if those shots, if he took them 5 feet further back and suddenly they're worth an extra point, and the fact that he took as many as he did, if he played in today's era, it's like almost scary. I mean, he averaged 37 points a game. He would have easily averaged 40 in today's game just by virtue of the fact that he could have shot the 3. So there's guys you don't want to compare, but it did make me think a little bit. I was like, man, I hate doing the like this era versus that era thing. I really do. But it did make me think with Jordan, like how he would have feasted in today's era where he could have gotten to the rim at will.